Hello, everybody. How are you doing today? And thank you so much for joining us for Genealogy in the Classroom. Genealogy in the Classroom is our third part of our series of genealogy and local history webinars. Next month is going to be on October 23rd, where Dr. Josh Goodman will be telling us on how to use land documents within genealogy. But on to today. So today's hosts are going to be myself, Brendan Goings, your continuing education coordinator, and my wonderful, wonderful coworker.
Hi, I'm Katrina Harkness, Education Officer with Florida Memory and State Archives of Florida.
And today's objectives, we're going to learn how genealogy and its tools can be used as a framework for lessons in the classroom. We're also going to explore genealogy within a lesson.
So first, what is genealogy? It's the study and tracing of the lines of descent or development. And when we're talking about studying lines of descent or development, we're sometimes talking about genetic heredity. But we can also use these same tools in this approach to talk about other kinds of relationships. Since this is football season, we can talk about a coach's coaching tree. Nick Saban, for instance, is football royalty. Coaches on the Nick Saban coaching tree, those who have worked for Saban as assistant coaches and have gone on to become head coaches, include Jimbo Fisher, Will Muschamp, and Kirby Smart.
And so what we're really looking at here is why we would use genealogy in the classroom. By utilizing genealogy and its tools, we get to map family histories and social relationships that create a framework for looking at history in a broader context. So let's set that stage for you. When we're talking about this, we're not meaning have your students go out and do their own personal genealogy. There's a lot involved there. You're never quite sure which rabbit hole they're going to find, or if they're going to discover some sort of family secret that the rest of the family doesn't want them to discover. So instead, we're talking about using historical figures genealogy. This way we know what we're going to find, and we can be prepared for all of the rabbit holes and adventures that are discovered when doing genealogy. The other thing that we're going to be looking at is a snapshot of the important connections. So we're not saying grab a historical figure and look at their greatest ancestor that you can locate. Instead, let's figure out how their genealogy has important connections to other historical figures of either the time or connecting two different times or two different events together. The other important reason that we might use historical figures is chronology. We want to help our students to understand how history or human relations developed over time. So sometimes there'll be a historical figure or family that just happened to have a very important presence throughout history. One example of this might be the British monarchy. We can trace them for a very long period of time through family descent. The other part is we're using historical figures and genealogy tools to link historical events. We're not just looking at the figures themselves or their relationships separate. We're actually going to be using all of these tools and all of these practices to bring different aspects together and show how everything relates to each other.
Okay, here we are looking at a snapshot of Queen Victoria and some of the major U.S. and world events that happened during her reign. So we see that she's crowned soon after or a few decades after the Civil War begins, the Civil War ends. Chicago Fire, what, I wonder, does Queen Victoria have to do with the Chicago Fire? Then we have the Spanish-American War, and in 1901, the death of Queen Victoria.
So the reason we showed you Queen Victoria is because we're going to be using Queen Victoria to do exactly what we're suggesting you guys utilize. So when you're building genealogy skills into lessons, you need to look at it from three different viewpoints. Using a historical figure as a framework for multiple lessons, using genealogy tools in lessons, and establishing a strong framework. So let's break that down and see what it means. When you're using a historical figure for multiple lessons, you want to make sure that this person has aspects or influence over a long period of time. We want to make sure that we can keep touching base with that person as we study history to see what their thoughts were during a particular time period or an event, or if they had direct influence. So some of the examples we have are Winston Churchill, a very prevalent figure. We all think about him, but we know him typically from World War II. However, if you look back in history, Winston Churchill had a fairly large influence from World War I through World War II, and a little bit beyond that as well. Another historical figure that gives us a long span of time and influence is Teddy Roosevelt, who we all really got to hear about from the Spanish-American War, but he was still influencing history and had contact with world leaders all the way up through and into World War I. And what's nice about Teddy Roosevelt, we have personal letters, we have journals, we have news articles. So there's plenty of primary sources directly from Teddy Roosevelt himself. And last but not least, when you're looking at a historical figure, we can look to see if they can help us jump between subject matters. So in the case of Ernest Hemingway, he can jump us from American history, where he was a soldier during World War I, into literature. And we can talk about some of his short stories or his novels. The other great part about Ernest Hemingway is we have enough letters and journals that are his personal effects that we can figure out where he's getting some of the motivation for his stories out of his life. Next, when we're looking at genealogical tools in lessons, I'm not talking a compass or anything along those lines. The tools that we're talking about are going to be timelines that help us to show how things are connected over time, pedigree charts, which allow us to show relationships, be them genetic or otherwise, and then research logs, which just help us keep on top of where we got our research, what we learned from that research, and what kind of questions came about while we were looking at that resource. And last but not least, we want to establish a framework. And this framework that I'm talking about is allowing us as the educator to bring together what the students are going to be looking through. They're still conducting research, as in they'll be looking through the materials to determine what they want to use. But this way you can kind of pull together the resources ahead of time and make sure that you are familiar with those resources and can kind of establish a baseline as to what you know the students should be getting out of those materials without having to constantly read 15 million different articles over the same subject matter. Instead, kind of set yourself up for success and give yourself a little wiggle room. So if you wanted to throw a curveball in the research, if you've just taught on how to tell between a authoritative source and a non-authoritative source, you could build a resource page with a bunch of resources that are valid and just throw in one or two unauthoritative and see if the students find that curveball. The ways that we're going to suggest that you do that, you would use either a Google Classroom, a Padlet page, which is what we will be showing you, or a teacher's web page. And this just gives you a place to house those resources that you've pulled together ahead of time. So let's show you how we would do it with Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria is a very influential historical figure, especially in Europe. Her reign lasted from 1837 to 1901. And so we can anchor many, many lessons on Queen Victoria's life during that time. So we're going to be looking at using her in a timeline situation, looking at using a pedigree chart with Queen Victoria, as well as research logs. And we're going to show you two different examples of that. We're going to show you a research log with Queen Victoria as the main subject matter for the research log. And we're also going to show you how a resource about Queen Victoria also is used in a research log about another event. And during that, we're also going to show you how these research logs can help you really bear home that lesson of a primary versus a secondary source.
When we're looking at how these skills tie into the standards, in creating timelines, the ability to use, analyze, and create timelines is an essential research skill that appears in the standards from kindergarten through high school.
So let's look at Queen Victoria's timeline. We saw this before, but now that we've kind of thought about it a little more, we can gain more from this. Queen Victoria, during her reign, would have to be replaced by 19 different U.S. presidents if we wanted to use American historical figures to cover the same time span. The other part of trying to get them to remember 19 different presidents and remember which order they came in can cause students to get events scrambled together. So by using Queen Victoria, we can show that it happened in one lifetime, versus if there's 19 different names, they're thinking these events occurred far distant from each other. Instead, we can show that these events happened within a single generational timeline. The other beautiful part about using Queen Victoria for this is Queen Victoria was known for her correspondence, as well as her journaling and her ability to keep track of different people and different events and her opinions. So we've got letters between not only other monarchs, but Queen Victoria also has letters to 18 out of those 19 presidents, with only one president not being included, and that's only because he didn't live long enough to receive her letter. Not that she didn't write it, she just didn't get a chance to send it. So let's look at how she might come into play with pedigree charts.
So looking at the pedigree charts, here are a couple of places that pedigree charts can touch on skills in the standards. Notice the crossover with social studies and science.
So from our timeline earlier, we saw that Queen Victoria's reign happened to connect with the Spanish-American War. Well, here is a pedigree chart where we kind of get to see where Queen Victoria, even though she is not part of the Spanish royalty, is still related to the event. So the Queen of Spain at the time was actually a queen regent, Maria Cristina. And she wrote to Queen Victoria and asked for advice onto how to handle these Americans influencing Cuba at the time and even getting involved. So why is it that Maria would have sent a letter to Queen Victoria? Well, it just so happens to work out that when we pull up the pedigree chart, we see that Queen Victoria and Maria Cristina are cousins. And they're cousins through the House of Lorraine, which is a royal family house. So in royal houses, what they do is they'll kind of group them together and give you a greater understanding of how everyone connects. But it also makes it easier because we don't have to figure out exactly which relative connects the two. When you're talking about royalty, if they declare themselves as the House of, in this case, Lorraine, if both sides say they're from the House of Lorraine, then we can stop doing our genealogical research. The snapshot is done. They're both House of Lorraine. All of our work is done. In the case of Queen Victoria, that means that we only had to go back one generation. Her mother, Maria Louise Victoria, is of the House of Lorraine. In the case of Maria Cristina, both of her parents were from the House of Lorraine. So we can find their connection very easily. when we're looking at these two more specifically, not only do we have the letter that Maria Christina sent to Queen Victoria, but if we want to show a personal connection and to why she might be asking advice of her cousin, we can also bring up pictures of the two of them playing together as children, as well as pictures from when they were at each other's palaces throughout their childhood, hanging out by the pool or playing other games together. And the parents would specifically do this with monarchs because they knew eventually they would be leading countries side by side and would have to do a lot of diplomatic work together. So they would make sure that they were exposed to each other and had built a friendship before the stress of leading a nation was added on top of it. So we kind of get to see where we can use this pedigree chart in U.S. history, but can we use this pedigree chart to jump subject matters? And in the case of Queen Victoria specifically, we can. Queen Victoria was a carrier of hemophilia, which is a recessive trait. This means that we can see how her bloodline influenced that of those of her descendants, and how a recessive trait is passed down through generations. The other wonderful benefit of using Queen Victoria in the history lesson and then turning around and using her in the science lesson, that students would be more vested in what was going on with this hemophilia and what it meant to her, as well as its influence on her children, and so on and so forth through the generations, all the way up to today. And the other great part is because this is a famous family, many historical figures, all of her children are also famous and are historical figures, so we can track their bloodline and the progression of hemophilia through their bloodline very easily. There's lots of documentation, and it's not a whole lot of work on our part. And if we wanted the students to do the research to find all the connections, it's really simple for them to do it as well. So last but not least, we are going to talk about using what I feel is one of the most important tools in this, the research log. The research log is basically a fantastic Excel sheet that shows how the students went from knowing nothing about a subject matter all the way down to where they found the information and what they learned. So this eventually becomes a folder or many folders on their computer that show progress of learning and evidence of learning. In the case here, we're going to be looking at a research log a little bit more in the traditional sense, where genealogy talks about it, where we keep it based upon a person. So in this case, this research log is specific to Queen Victoria. And when I'm talking about the log itself, you're going to be looking at the blue shades of boxes down at the bottom. We go from a dark blue to a very, very light. And in a research log, you're going to see certain columns that are exactly what you're seeing here, except because we're in a school setting, we added the primary and secondary source column. Otherwise, you're going to have the record number, which is the order in which they found the information. You're going to have the document name, which there is a naming scheme to it. So in the case of a research log, the naming scheme is always going to be who this research log is about, and in this case that would be Queen Victoria, dates associated with that person, and if it is a person, it's going to be the date of their birth to the date of their death, and then what number record it was. Then we're going to put in our location as to where we found this information. This way we can always go back and double check that we wrote something down correctly, or if we aren't sure where we've searched already and people are just throwing us names, we can look through our log and go, oh, that's right, I already looked there and I found this. Next, we're going to write down what it is we learned from that source, specific to the research log subject matter. So in this case, Queen Victoria. Then we're going to have notes, anything we learned that may or may not be specific to our subject matter. And last but not least, we're going to have a comments column. And that comments column is where we put questions as they pop up, or thoughts or ideas that we want to explore further. In the case of a classroom, this column becomes very, very important because this allows students to get down those extraneous thoughts about the subject matter without having to stop the rest of the class to address it immediately, and not feeling that it isn't important that we capture that, or that they're not important if we weren't able to call on their hand quickly the second they had that question. So instead, this comments column can be used to capture later. So we can say, put the thought down in the comments column, and then later we're going to have a sharing moment and see what kind of comments people came up with and see how many we can answer based on what other people in the room have discovered. So let's kind of see one of these research logs in action. At the top of this slide, you are going to find an image of a book plate, as well as some paragraphs up at the top. And what we've done with this is we've given you a single source of resource, which happens to be off of the Chicago Public Library history page. And this is where we're getting to use that primary and secondary source education with students, is showing that this page isn't a primary source in and of itself. However, it does feature both a primary and a secondary source. And we're getting them to understand the importance or difference between the two and how to tell. So when we look down at our research log, we're going to, in the example, the primary source part of it, the red boxed image at the top, is going to be our record number 8. This is the 8th thing that we have learned about Queen Victoria, or the 8th item that we have found that teaches us something about Queen Victoria. It is a primary source. It's showing us that it is from 1871. And we have a signature that looks a lot like Queen Victoria's. It may have been someone else's hand, but at least now we know it is, in fact, a primary source. Then we're going to be teaching, once again, how to use that document name. Because this one is in a research log about Queen Victoria, we would save this image or this resource on the computer as Queen Victoria, 1819 to 1901, number 8. This way, when we have our folder that is marked Queen Victoria, this item shows up as the 8th one in the list every time, and so we can help students navigate through the resources that they've saved on their computer, or their jump drive if you are in a classroom with computers where everyone has their own computer yet. Then we're going to list the location of access. This ensures that, 1, students remember where we found this information, but 2, it also gives you a chance to talk with them about, was this an authoritative source? Was it not? Is this really the best place we could be looking? All of those different things. And then, last but not least, what did we learn from this source? So we're talking about the red box. And within that, we're able to see that this was presented to the city of Chicago towards the formation of a free library after the Great Fire of 1871. So this means that we've now linked Queen Victoria to the Chicago Fire in 1871, and that she donated materials to Chicago after the event, which is pretty significant. She's all the way in England during this time, and people wouldn't necessarily have thought that Queen Victoria would care as to what was going on in Chicago at the time. But this primary source shows us that she really did. And unfortunately, that's all it tells us. We have no other information except that. So our notes field is going to be empty next to that because there's no further information there. And As I was reading it, this did not spark a question for me, but it could have, which means in this case, the comment box is empty. And then we're going to move over to the other side of our resource, the secondary source, which happens to be the 9th record that we discovered. It is, in fact, a secondary source. It is talking about a primary source, and it is occurring outside of that time. Once again, though, it's going to be named the same way. It'll be Queen Victoria, 1819 to 1901, record number 9. It was found in the exact same location, but it's going to tell us quite a bit more. When we're looking at this resource specifically through the lens of what it's telling us about Queen Victoria, this resource tells us that Queen Victoria participated in what was known as the English Book Donation. And that's all it really tells us that's specific to Queen Victoria. But it does give us more in the way of we can get notes out of this. So from this resource, we learned that 8,000 books were donated. However, we don't know how many of those came from Queen Victoria. It doesn't say. It just says 8,000 books in all. So we get to use that comments field as well. As the question may come up, as it did in my mind, I wonder if there is a source that can tell us exactly the number of books that were donated by Queen Victoria to go towards this free library. And so this is an example of a research log about a person. So we're looking at these resources from the perspective of what we can learn about Queen Victoria and what it tells us about her as a person. Let's now take a second and look at the same research log format, but from the example of it being used as an event and seeing what we can learn about an event. And we're going to go ahead and use these same 2 resources. That way you can see that you and your students both would be able to see that if you're looking at a resource with a certain idea in mind, you're going to gather different information from that resource.
Mm-hmm. Brendan, you keep referring to the library that was formed after the fire as a free library. Why was it called a free library?
The reason it was called a free library is because previous to that time, there was a lot of libraries that were actually membership based, and people had to pay a club membership fee to be part of it.
So this was the first free library in Chicago?
This was the first free library in Chicago that was open to the public and required no membership. So in the case, if we're looking at this from the perspective of the Great Chicago Fire, yes, totally agreed. I'm glad somebody caught on to that.
Let's read off what they said.
And I will certainly read off what they said. So Jason pointed out, as always, any source used from the internet should have a date the information was accessed. The Chicago Public Library could update the information in the future, or the information could, sorry, my thing's not scrolling, could disappear altogether. Citing when as well as where should always be included and taught from the very beginning. So remember earlier where I said make sure to put curveballs in some of that research? This one kept coming up even as we were putting these slides together, where I had to stop myself from putting the date of access because I wanted to make sure that this curveball was in there to see if any of you would catch that. So thank you so much, Jason, for catching that exactly when I expected you to, or around the time when I expected somebody to. So thank you for that. And that kind of showcases where we're looking for that. So in the case here, we're looking at the Great Chicago Fire, which means that our document names are no longer going to say Queen Victoria. Our document names and folder are going to be named Great Chicago Fire, and going to include the dates associated with the fire, which technically doesn't have a birth, nor does it have a death. But we do have that it occurred in October 8th through October 10th in 1871. Now, some of the events associated with it will occur outside of those dates, but really, when we're talking the Great Chicago Fire, those are the dates we think about. So that's how the documents are going to be named. In the example here, this is the 7th resource we found. When we're looking at that red box item, what does it tell us about the Great Chicago Fire? Well, it tells us that Queen Victoria donated books in 1871 towards the formation of a free library in response to the Great Chicago Fire. The other part that it tells us that we didn't capture in the last one, because it didn't really have that much note to it in the perspective of Queen Victoria, but as from the perspective of the Great Chicago Fire, this bookplate was actually in the early years of His Royal Highness the Prince Consort, 1819 to 1841, which just helps us place again that the book is in the collection, as well as what kind of titles might have been included in that donation. When we're looking at the secondary source side of this, from the Great Chicago Fire, we not only note that this was an English book donation, but it was proposed by and carried out by A.H. Burgess of London. And that, again, the donations totaled 8,000 books. But it doesn't tell us who A.H. Burgess is and why he would be associated with Chicago at the time. So this gives us a great chance to see if students come up with that question and want to explore his influence or his impact at that time even further. But this gives you a chance to see how a research log comes up over and over again and can be used from different perspectives. This research log can also be used not only in history, but we can use a research log for what did we learn in literature, what did we learn in our sciences as we move through different chapters, different lessons. Each one of those things can get different file names and folders, and this way we can really show off our students' learning and help them to recognize how much they've learned within a year. So we've talked about doing it with the perspective of Queen Victoria. So let's break it down a little bit further. How do you get started? So we've seen here where Queen Victoria kind of carried us for a while. The next major U.S. event that would be coming up is World War I. So how would we kind of get started thinking about it from the perspective of having to hang a World War I lesson off of whoever this person is? First and foremost, you sit down and you start noting people in your head associated with World War I. So we've got Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, we've got King George V of England, and we've got Tsar Nikolai of Russia. All three of whom were monarchs at the time from the major nations involved in the beginning of World War I. The other benefit of using these three is that they all just happen to be cousins to each other, and if we're circling back, because we've already hung a lesson off of her, they're all descendants of Queen Victoria. And we have letters, correspondence, and various other entries from both Queen Victoria or them to Queen Victoria talking about their relationships between each other. Unfortunately, Queen Victoria was not around during World War I, but we have plenty of notes and journal entries, especially from King George V, talking about how Grandma would not have appreciated this in any way, shape, or form, and would have put a stop to the war long before it began. Other people of note for World War I that we can find helpful and begin to explore as we're looking through it would be Winston Churchill, the Roosevelts, both Theodore and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, especially because the Churchill family and the Roosevelt family are related. So we can kind of bridge between the different sides of the Atlantic. Other people that show up in World War I that we may not have thought about. Adolf Hitler begins in World War I, which means I can begin to hang lessons off of him and see how he progresses a little bit into the future. Some of us might be able to think about where he shows up again in history. The other thing would be Ernest Hemingway, once again, who helps us bridge between subject matters at this time. So we don't necessarily have to bridge a timeline completely outside or within history itself. We can start hanging the timeline off of when he wrote what pieces and where those different influences came from as a timeline. So let's go ahead and jump into an example as to how each of the tools shows up when looking at these different historical figures, as well as how you begin to wrap your head around how to use these tools so that when students are doing it, you kind of have a gist as to what they're going to find and how they might fill it in. So remember earlier when I said let's pull resources together ahead of time? This is an example of doing that. This is a Padlet page that I pulled together for World War I specifically. And those people of influence that we talked about. So we've got columns that provide us resources for Nikolai II, King George V, Kaiser Wilhelm, the royal connections, because of course I'm not going to tell my students that these three are related. I want them to discover it, but I need to make sure that they're going to discover the right connections and not some sort of conspiracy theory website that is going to give them different connections. So in this case, I'm going to plug in the resources that give them those answers. Next, I'm going to look at other people of note, from Ernest Hemingway and Churchill to Theodore Roosevelt or Adolf Hitler once again. The other benefit of pulling the resources together ahead of time is I can get resources of different types and allow students to self-explore within these resources. So on here, I have in the first row just images of the three monarchs of the time. Next, I include documentaries specific to these individuals. These are a level of detail that I don't have time to cover in the classroom. But as homework, the kids can watch these documentaries, or they can click through to find which ones they're interested in watching, and can explore them at their own pace. And this enables our auditory learners to kind of catch up and gather more information, as well as our visual learners. And last but not least, I'm going to make sure that we include our textual learners, and we are going to include documentaries. Not the visual documentaries, but instead encyclopedia entries and other text-based learning about our important characters. So let's look at a few examples based on, and you guys will be receiving these slides afterwards. This is actually an active Padlet page, and you guys will be able to click the link and go to it and see how this might work with your students. So when I'm planning on doing a lesson, I go ahead and lay out the research log, the Padlet, and the timeline for myself to make sure that my students would know, or to make sure that the information my students need is very, very clear in the resources I found. So in the case here, I've kind of done a quick example with Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. You can see in the timeline that he was born in 1859 and crowned in 1888. He supported the Austria-Hungary during the crisis of 1914, which is something that students may not have heard that term before. We tend to talk about the assassination and immediately jump into World War I and forget that there was a little bit of period of time between when the assassination occurred and when the war started. So that period was actually referred to as the crisis of 1914. And that our Kaiser Wilhelm died in 1941. There are other important events in his timeline, but because of the lesson being focused in World War I, these are the ones that were most prominent about his character of this time period. Last but not least, I'm going to look at a quick snapshot of his genealogy in a pedigree chart. So what are important connections that he has in his family? And as we're discovering through, and as I've already told you guys, the real strong connection here is his connection to Queen Victoria. And so we have to show students how that connection occurred, or give them the tools to discover that connection for themselves. So in this case, Kaiser Wilhelm II is son to Princess Victoria, who is the daughter of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Next, we're going to look at the resources that we put on our page for the students to look through, and which resources they might discover this information through. In the case here, I used our documentary about Kaiser Wilhelm II. And this told us that he was the last German emperor. And as you can see, when we're talking about that resource, I did use the proper naming system. So it's going to be Kaiser Wilhelm II, 1859 through 1941. And this is the first thing that this documentary tells students about Kaiser Wilhelm. Next, as they're listening to that resource, they're going to find that it gives them lots of things. So there's lots of different examples about it. And they're going to see that Kaiser Wilhelm II is grandson to Queen Victoria by her oldest daughter, Victoria. And hopefully, if students are thinking about it as they go along, they'll wonder how a German emperor is related to a British queen, and might help them to see some of those connections. So we might get a comment such as, does this mean he's related to the British monarch at that time? Next, we're going to look at King George V of England for this. And we get his brief timeline once again. We get to look at his connection to Queen Victoria, which is a snapshot of the important genealogy parts, and his familiar relations. But when we get into the documentary, we start to learn quite a bit more about King George V. More specifically, he is the grandson of Queen Victoria, but he's not the first son of his father. And if you know about monarchies, it goes to the firstborn. So we get to find out that there's more to the story as to King George V getting to the throne than meets the eye. As well as King George V was not originally, because he was not the firstborn, meant to be the monarch. So he did things very differently and did not necessarily receive the same education as the heir apparent, as that was not his original role. He also, personality-wise, was not your traditionally raised monarch, because his intended career was that of the Navy, which means that this is one of our first monarchs that had a tattoo, and more specifically, a dragon tattoo. So this can give students a hook to be interested in learning more about history, because it gives them surprising facts.
We've got another comment.
Mm-hmm.
Jason says, should students always verify secondary sources by finding primaries to support what they learned and then supersede the information?
That is certainly one way to do it. The other would be to make sure that they're getting the secondary information from a valid resource. So this is when you're doing those lessons on how do I determine if a resource is valid. Does it have a scholastic credential associated with it? Who was the author? Do they have some sort of credentials? Those kind of things. Or does the resource tell me where it gathered the information, and was that a valid resource? So it gives you a chance to let them see it. They don't always have to chase down a primary resource, because that's not always practical. And we want them to understand that they can trust that certain people have done that, as long as we're grabbing it from resources that prove themselves to do that kind of thing. So if it's from a scholarly resource that has a listing of, and this is where I got all my information, we can usually trust that. And they've kind of proven themselves to be a trustworthy source.
So we've looked at a lot of sources to talk about European history, but what about when we want to talk about Florida history? Well, here we have a couple of points that connect Florida to what's going on in the rest of the world. We've already talked about Ernest Hemingway. Here he is in Key West in 1940. Of course, he lived in Key West for a time. During the First World War, Ernest Hemingway volunteered to serve in Italy as an ambulance driver with the American Red Cross. He was wounded in June 1918. Hemingway fell in love with his Red Cross nurse, and he went on to write A Farewell to Arms about a wounded ambulance driver who fell in love with his Red Cross nurse. The novel is an epic romance. The real life is a little bit different. The nurse in question, a few weeks later, went on to write to Hemingway to let him know that she was getting married, and also went on to say, I tried hard to make you understand a bit of what I was thinking on that trip from Padua to Milan, but you acted like a spoiled child. So this is one of those places where we can bridge history and literature. On the right, Theodore Roosevelt is here, and of course you recognize immediately the great city of Tampa, or maybe you don't. But Tampa was a small town, but the Spanish-American War, the soldiers were staged in Tampa before they went to Cuba. The influx of soldiers turned Tampa from a small town into a thriving city. So Theodore Roosevelt led the Rough Riders and became governor of New York. From then he ran for vice president on the McKinley-Roosevelt ticket. When McKinley was assassinated, only months after taking office, Roosevelt became president. Roosevelt is, of course, the uncle of Eleanor Roosevelt, who did not change her name when she married Franklin. She was already a Roosevelt, and yes, Theodore Roosevelt was also Franklin D. Roosevelt's fifth cousin. So there is information on Florida memory. On our classroom, we have units. There's one on the Spanish-American War. Now, if you're looking for some figures in Florida to hang multiple lessons on, the way we did with Queen Victoria, one choice would be Mary McLeod Bethune. Mary McLeod Bethune is an important historical figure in Florida from 1904, when she built her school, until her death in 1955, 1 year after the Supreme Court's historic Brown v. Board of Education decision that ended legally enforced segregation of public schools. Bethune is important in number of ways. She was an advisor to multiple presidents. We see she was friends with Eleanor Roosevelt. She was an advisor to Franklin Roosevelt. Here's Eleanor Roosevelt visiting the school. Here's Mary McLeod Bethune with President Truman. Bethune brought people together from all over to support her school and to support the goals of equality in education, economic opportunity, and full equality in the abundance of life. She was a key figure in both World War I and World War II. Here we're looking at the catalog of the Daytona Educational and Industrial Training School 1910, and to talk about her connection to community figures, here is James Gamble Proctor of Procter & Gamble. I'm sorry, James Gamble of Procter & Gamble. He was the son of the founder of Procter & Gamble, and he was the first chairman of the board of trustees of the school, and he was also the chemist who invented Ivory soap. Mary McLeod Bethune knew a lot of people. She met the Pope in Italy. She was present for the founding of the United Nations in California. She traveled a lot and knew a lot of people. There are so many stories, and we don't have time to tell them all, but if you get into researching them, you will discover them for yourself.
So if you decided to go down the rabbit hole of following Mary McLeod Bethune through her many adventures and connections throughout history, one of the things you're going to want to do is build a Padlet page very much, or a resource page very much similar to the one that we've shown before and are showing again here. Give your students a chance to follow the thread. Don't give them the answers right away, but instead pad a page with resources that contain that information and let them explore it for themselves. Many studies have shown that self-exploration in education leads to greater retention, as well as allows students to find what they're interested in about the subject, which is going to spark them to want to learn more and to reach further than they would traditionally do. And last but not least, when we're thinking about using genealogy in the classroom, we need to think about it in the greater context. Follow the threads. Family and social connections are woven throughout history. No event or person is an isolated incident. All of these things are connected together and make the great tapestry that is human history, as well as humanity as a whole. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Do we have any questions?
This is Melissa. As I told you guys before, you can either raise your hand by clicking the hand raise button and we can unmute your microphones, or you can just type your questions into chat. And we'll make sure that we stay on a few more minutes so that if you guys do have questions, in case you're typing, that we can get those answered. And thank you, Jason, for your great questions. And we thank all of you guys for being on today, and stay tuned for our next one in October. Is it the 23rd?
It is October 23rd with Dr. Josh Goodman, using land documents in genealogy. Also keep in mind that all of this series is available on our YouTube channel, and you guys can use the recordings over and over again. Feel free to download them, snip them up however you need to, and utilize them. They are yours to use.
So we'll be sending out a follow-up email to anyone that registers for these classes, or any of our webinars for that matter. It includes the link to the recording, PowerPoints, and any other resource links that could be useful to you guys.
We're not seeing any questions as of this moment. So I thank you all so much for being on, and we will go ahead and wrap up for today. Hope to see you on next month.